Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Islamic Rule in Medieval Spain, by Dario Fernández-Morera. Narrated by Bob Souer. Masendo l'intento mio scrivere cosa utile a chi la intende, mi è parso più conveniente andare dritto alla verità effettuale delle cose, che alle immaginazioni di essa. Niccolò Machiavelli, Il Principe, capitolo 15. Introduction. On the intellectual level, Islam played an important role in the development of Western European civilization by passing on both the philosophy of Aristotle and its own scientific, technological, and philosophical tradition. Religious tolerance remained a part of Islamic law, although its application varied with social, political, and economic circumstances. Bert F. Briner and Christian W. Troll, Christianity and Islam, in the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, editor John L. Esposito. In the Middle Ages there emerged two Europes, one Muslim Europe secure in its defenses, religiously tolerant, and maturing in cultural and scientific sophistication. The other, Christian Europe, an arena of unceasing warfare in which superstition passed for religion and the flame of knowledge sputtered weakly. David Levering Lewis, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and Julius Silver Professor of History at New York University. God's Crucible, Islam and the Making of Europe, 570 to 1215. Muslim rulers of the past were far more tolerant of people of other faiths than were Christian ones. For example, al-Andalus's multicultural, multi-religious states, ruled by Muslims, gave way to a Christian regime that was grossly intolerant even of dissident Christians, and that offered Jews and Muslims a choice only between being forcibly converted and being expelled or worse. Islam and the West, never the twain shall peacefully meet. The Economist, November 15, 2001. The standard-bearers of tolerance in the early Middle Ages were far more likely to be found in Muslim lands than in Christian ones. Tony Blair, then Prime Minister of Great Britain, A Battle for Global Values, Foreign Affairs, January-February 2007. This book aims to demystify Islamic Spain by questioning the widespread belief that it was a wonderful place of tolerance and convivencia of three cultures under the benevolent supervision of enlightened Muslim rulers. As the epigraphs throughout this book illustrate, the 19th-century romantic vision of Islamic Spain has morphed into today's mainstream academic and popular writings that celebrate al-Andalus for its multiculturalism, unity of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, diversity and pluralism, regardless of how close such emphasis is to the facts. Some scholars of the Spanish Middle Ages have even openly declared an interest in promoting these ideas. Demythologizing this civilization requires focusing a searching light on medieval cultural features that may seem less than savory to modern listeners, and that perhaps for this reason are seldom discussed. The first two chapters of this book examine how Spain was conquered and colonized by the forces of the Islamic Caliphate. Some scholars have argued that the Muslim takeover was accomplished largely through peaceful pacts. Some even refuse to call it a conquest, preferring to call it a migratory wave. Other scholars argue that the conquest was carried out by force. Neither side is entirely right. The Muslim conquerors used force to defeat the resistance of the Christian Visigoth kingdom, a nascent civilization. But they also granted pacts to those Visigoth lords and Christian leaders who saw it as advantageous to accept the offered peace and become dhimmis, those Christians and Jews living in subaltern status in Islamic lands, rather than face the consequences of resisting. Behind the peaceful pacts was always the threat of brutal force. The remaining chapters of this book examine fundamental aspects of Islamic Spain that are rarely highlighted: religious, and therefore cultural repression in all areas of life, and the marginalization of certain groups. All this in the service of social control by autocratic rulers and a class of religious authorities. The proponents of a harmonious and fruitful convivencia sometimes adduce as proof the mutual influences among Muslims and non-Muslims and their military alliances. But this argument overlooks that mutual influences, coexistence in the same territory, cooperation, military alliances, and even intermarriage and productive and fascinating artistic results frequently obtain as a matter of course in places where different cultures have been antagonistic, from Spanish and Portuguese Latin America to British India to French Algeria to the American West to even the slaveholding American South, without this in any way diminishing the fact of conflict between cultures or the existence of some groups who dominate and others who are dominated. Of course, there was convivencia, in this rather banal sense, between conquerors and conquered. But this cannot be considered characteristic of Islamic Spain. It is characteristic of cultural clashes between hegemonic and hegemonized groups most everywhere. This book's interpretive stance is Machiavellian, not Panglossian. Those who portray Islamic Spain as an example of peaceful coexistence frequently cite the fact that Muslim, Jewish, and Christian groups in al-Andalus sometimes lived near one another. Even when that was the case, however, such groups dwelled more often than not in their own neighborhoods. More to the point, even when individual Muslims, Jews, and Christians cooperated with one another out of convenience, necessity, mutual sympathy, or love, these three groups and their own numerous subgroups engaged for centuries in struggles for power and cultural survival, manifested in often subtle ways that should not be glossed over for the sake of modern ideals of tolerance, diversity, and convivencia. A culture of forgetting. The Umayyad Caliphate collapsed in the 11th century. In 1085, Alfonso VI, Christian king of Leon and Castile, captured Toledo. Unlike the Franks, he knew better than to impose Catholicism on the people at the point of a sword. The spirit of tolerance that the Arabs had created survived their departure. It took nearly 4 more centuries to get to the religious intolerance of the Spanish Inquisition. Kwame Anthony Appiah, Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy, Princeton University, How Muslims Made Europe, New York Review of Books, November 6, 2008. It is not easy to explain the existence of this culture of forgetting that has allowed the fashioning of a certain kind of Islamic Spain. It can hardly be explained by linguistic ignorance, since the primary medieval Latin, Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew sources required for a good general understanding of Islamic Spain have been translated into accessible Western languages such as Spanish, French, English, and German, in some cases more than once, and in any event, many scholars of Arabic and Islamic studies also engage in this hagiographic fashioning. Perhaps writers have thought that the artistic achievements of al-Andalus cannot withstand a more realistic appraisal of its society. Perhaps it has to do with what economists call stakeholder interests and incentives, which affect the research of academics in the humanities no less, and perhaps even more than those in the sciences. Perhaps it has to do with what psychologists call motivated blindness, which inhibits an individual's ability to perceive inconvenient data. Perhaps it has to do with the innocence of intellectuals. Perhaps it is simply the result of shoddy research by a number of university professors, repeated by many journalists. Or perhaps, since the 18th century Enlightenment, the critical construction of a diverse, tolerant, and happy Islamic Spain has been part of an effort to sell a particular cultural agenda, which would have been undermined by the recognition of a multicultural society racked by ethnic, religious, social, and political conflicts that eventually contributed to its demise. A multicultural society held together only by the ruthless power of autocrats and clerics. This ideological mission would then be the ultimate reason for the tilting of the narrative against Catholic Spain prevalent since the Enlightenment and the writings of Voltaire and Edward Gibbon. Briskly selling, beautifully illustrated books have contributed to this intellectual construction. In the past few decades, This ideological mission has morphed into presentism, an academically sponsored effort to narrate the past in terms of the present, and thereby reinterpret it to serve contemporary multicultural, diversity, and peace studies, which necessitate rejecting as retrograde, chauvinistic, or worse, conservative, any view of the past that may conflict with the progressive agenda. Thus, it is stupendous to see how some academic specialists turn and twist to downplay religion as the motivating force in Muslim conquests, and even to question the invasion of Spain by Muslim Arab-led Berbers as the conquest of one culture and its religion by another. Failing to take seriously the religious factor in Islamic conquests is characteristic of a certain type of materialist Western historiography which finds it uncomfortable to accept that war and the willingness to kill and die in it can be the result of someone's religious faith, an obstacle to understanding that may reflect the role played by religious faith in the lives of many academic historians. This materialist approach has also generally prevailed in scholarly analyses of the Crusades. In Spain, the reality of al-Andalus is better known, thanks to the work of historians like Luis A. García Moreno, Francisco García Fitz, Manuel González Jiménez, Miguel Ángel Ladero Quesada, and Antonio Domínguez Ortiz, legal scholars like Ramón Peralta, Arabists like María Luisa Ávila, Soha Abud Hagar, Serafín Fanjul, Ana Fernández Feliz, María Isabel Fierro, Mercedes García Arenal, Teresa Garulo, Felipe Mayo Salgado, Manuela Marín, Celia del Moral, Cristina de la Puente, Joaquín Balbé Bermejo, and María Jesús Viguera Molins, and popularizers like César Vidal. Nonetheless, even in Spain, rhapsodic accounts predominate, perhaps traceable to a 19th-century Spanish historiography that did not distinguish among Muslim, Arab, Berber, Muladi, Dhimmi, Slav, and other cultural and ethnic categories, but fashioned instead a simple and wonderful entity called Civilización Hispano-Árabe. The 20th century polemics between the literary scholar Américo Castro and the historian Claudio Sánchez Albornoz on the nature of the Spaniards fell victim to this starry-eyed intellectual conflation. Castro did not cite Islamic legal texts from al-Andalus or anywhere else, and he made no use of archaeological materials. These lacunae prompted him to repeat inherited shibboleths about tolerance and convivencia. Sánchez Albornoz was better informed, but lack of familiarity with legal texts was also evident in his writing. Thus, for Sánchez Albornoz too, Muslim women in al-Andalus enjoyed an enviable freedom when compared to Muslim women elsewhere. In Germany, Italy, and France, the works of scholars such as Adèle Theodore-Curie, Roberto de Mattei, Alfred Moravia, and Sylvain Guggenheim are exceptions to the rule, but they have struggled against the resistance of experts in university departments. Significantly, none of these books were published by university presses. Guggenheim's case is instructive. Guggenheim argued that medieval Islamic culture remained, with the exception of science, construction techniques, and some aspects of philosophy, generally unreceptive to the spirit of Greek civilization. Among other things, it was indifferent or antagonistic to such fundamentals of that civilization as representational sculpture and painting, drama, narrative, lyric, and political theory and practice. Even in philosophy, Islam remained in part a stranger to the Greek spirit. Guggenheim's book also reminded its readers that Greek texts had not been lost, to be graciously discovered and transmitted by the Islamic Empire, but in fact had been preserved, transmitted, and commented upon in the Christian Greek-Roman Empire, usually referred to as the Byzantine Empire, that the translations of Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic were done by Greek-speaking Christians from the conquered lands of the Christian Greek-Roman Empire, that Aristotle had been translated in France at the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel before translations of Aristotle into Arabic, via the Syrian of the Christian scholars from the conquered lands of the Christian Greek-Roman Empire, surfaced in Islamic Spain, and that there was a continuity between Greek and European civilization via the Christian Greek-Roman Empire that did not require Islam's appearance on the historical scene. Guggenheim's book was considered so threatening to the educational establishment that an international collective of 56 researchers in history and philosophy found it necessary to sign an open letter published in the Marxist newspaper Libération attacking his work. His book was said to offer nothing that was not already well known to scholars. The demonization of Guggenheim and the apparent need for acts of academic exorcism of his work continued when the Sorbonne University organized a scholarly colloquium to denounce his book, and then his own school declared publicly that it did not share his views. Among the milder scholarly epithets used to describe his book have been ignorant, ignare, a polemic disguised as scholarship, full of conceptual incoherence, a diatribe, a plundering book, sacre-gueule, a work scientifically dishonest, a dishonor to its publisher, an amateurish work based on compilation and a priori assumptions, a sad case, a work of fear and hatred, cultural racism, embarrassing, discredited, a dereliction of historical deontology, a product of retrograde Catholic ideology, not qualified to go against the consensus of specialists regarding medieval Islam and Christianity, and, of course, Islamophobic and part of a contemporary scholarly Islamophobia, Islamophobie savante. Islamic studies professors brandished the argument from authority against Guggenheim by gleefully pointing out that he was not an Arabist, but an ideologically motivated interloper who had no business in a scholarly field not his own, and then combed his book in a remarkably thorough search for errors, slips, or bibliographical inaccuracies. But then no Arabist or Islamic studies academic expert would have been likely to write a book questioning the claims made by Arabists and Islamic studies academic experts regarding the beneficial influence of medieval Islam on Christian Europe. A hermeneutics of suspicion would point out that such questioning would endanger the attractiveness of the field of research that provides a living for the Islamic studies experts, and that such questioning would also risk an end to travel to Muslim countries to do research, a loss of funding for the heretical scholars and their universities, not only from grant-giving institutions, but also from governments such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, Libya under Gaddafi, and Turkey. Ostracism as graduate students, and difficulty finding university positions, assuming the scholars were able to complete a PhD in a department of Middle East studies. Critics have documented the way money from Islamic nations has compromised Islamic and Middle East studies in Western universities. Guggenheim's case is redolent of that of the great Spanish Arabist Francisco Javier Simonet, 1829 to 1897, more than a century earlier. Simonet's monumental work on the Mozarabs could not find a publisher during his lifetime because of the opposition of influential liberal Spanish Arabists who objected to Simonet's Catholic and conservative views on Islamic Spain. Doubtlessly, professional self-preservation as well as political correctness and economics has affected academic research in certain fields of study, in contrast to the fearlessness demonstrated by professors when unmasking horrors in such dangerous areas of investigation as Christian Europe, the burning of witches, colonialism, and Catholic Spain, the ubiquitous Spanish Inquisition. Islamic Spain is no exception to the rule. University presses do not want to get in trouble presenting an Islamic domination of even centuries ago as anything but a positive event, and academic specialists would rather not portray negatively a subject that constitutes their bread and butter. In addition, fear of the accusation of Islamophobia has paralyzed many academic researchers. The publication of a book on Mohammed cartoons by Yale University Press illustrates all these problems. Initially, the book was to be accompanied by cartoons of Muhammad published in Denmark, which many Muslims had protested by killing at least 200 people around the world between 2005 and 2006 alone. But comments on the manuscript's material by some academic experts in history and religion prompted the Yale University administration to cancel the publication of the cartoons, as well as an illustration by the 19th century artist Gustave Doré of a passage in the Divina Commedia where Dante places Muhammad in hell. So, in 2009, the book on the Muhammad cartoons was published by Yale University Press, but without the Muhammad cartoons. What is real? God's universe in al-Andalus had three principal and interlocking features which are at the heart of its importance for us, and which were in its own time at the heart of that culture's extraordinarily vigorous well-being: ethnic pluralism, religious tolerance, and a variety of important forms of what we could call cultural secularism, secular poetry and philosophy that were not understood by those who pursued them to be or anti-Islamic. Maria Rosa Menocal, R. Selden Rose Professor of Spanish and Portuguese and Director of the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale University, Culture in the Time of Tolerance, Al-Andalus as a Model for Our Time, Yale Law School Occasional Papers, Year 2000, Paper 1. Scholars who celebrate, for example, the presumed laxity of religious and moral restraints enjoyed by the people of Al-Andalus, or these people's ability to be both religious and capable of writing delightfully erotic heterosexual and homosexual poetry, may do so not simply because they operate in a particular historical, political, and educational context with its resulting ideology, fears, and taboos. Their work may also reflect the more technical factor of limiting oneself to the examination of certain kinds of documents. Wide-eyed visions of a wonderful because morally loose al-Andalus extrapolate from the dissolute lives of some Muslim rulers and their court intellectuals to the everyday life of the Muslim or Jewish or Christian masses. The hedonistic ways of the Taifa monarchs of the 11th century have been particularly entrancing to some English-speaking academics, who pay little regard to the fact that, as Spanish Arabists like Serafín Fanjul and Felipe Mayo Salgado have pointed out, the average Muslim's life in Al-Andalus was marked by clerical supervision of detailed religious observance, and often by family, tribal, and blood feuds. This selective approach is as scholarly defective as would be assessing the everyday life and moral preferences of 20th century American families based on a reading of the historical records left behind by Hollywood actors and American artistes and literati, or assessing the everyday life and moral preferences of 20th century Saudis based on the historical record left behind in Europe by some princes and princesses of the Saudi royal family. Such evidence, though quite fascinating and perhaps of great aesthetic value, is not indicative of how the vast majority of a population lives or what its beliefs and moral preferences are. A different approach is needed for a better understanding of a civilization. As the brilliant Muslim political thinker Ibn Zafar wrote in the 12th century, priority must be given to what is real rather than approximation. Some recent scholars in the English-speaking world have done excellent work, but with the exception of Emmett Scott, they have either concerned themselves mainly with the Jewish experience or not adopted the approach of the present book, which looks at these cultures synchronically and comparatively, examining literary, historical, legal, religious, biographical, archaeological, and other cultural materials in order to show a humanity both suffering and inflicting suffering. All too often, books in English do not show a mastery of the work of Spanish scholars. This book examines certain cultural aspects of the condition of Muslims, Jews, and Christians in medieval Islamic Spain in order to throw light upon the mental structures and the collective representations of this society. It does not pass judgment on today's Muslims, Jews, or Christians, or on their religions. It does not support a clash between present-day civilizations, although it does not adopt as its goal to build bridges either. It advises readers to be cautious and keep in mind the differences that exist between the medieval and the modern worlds of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity before trying to find reassuring or disturbing similarities between the two. And it rejects all anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, and anti-Christian viewpoints. Or, as modern critical jargon would put it, readers should keep in mind that the texts examined are historically situated cultural constructs. This book does not attempt to examine the possibility, entertained by many Western experts on Islam and by some modern Muslim scholars influenced by Western thought, that, for centuries, intelligent and learned ulama, clerics, and Muslim rulers either misunderstood the Quran or purposely distorted it in various ways, including through the invention of ahadith, traditional narratives of Muhammad's sayings and deeds, or sunnah, because of prescriptions of gender and power, or because of their patriarchal interests, or because they were shaped by the socio-economic forces of their time, or for some other covert reason that today's scholars somehow are not subject to and can therefore unmask and explain disinterestedly. Nor does the book attempt to examine the assumption that truth is on the side of those among today's Western expert interpreters who argue, in what has become a veritable literary subgenre, not only that the Quran does not really mean what for centuries fuqaha, experts on Islamic law, variously thought it meant, but even that Sharia has nothing to do with Muhammad's teachings, and that Islamic texts can be reconciled with Western notions of political, religious, and sexual liberty. This particular understanding of the Quran may be true, but, to borrow Cervantes's words, it matters little for our story. What matters much for our story is that, for the culture of medieval Islam in al-Andalus, the important texts were not so much the Quran as the religious laws as interpreted by the ulama of the Maliki legal school, that for the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence that dominated al-Andalus, as was also the case generally for other schools of law in classical Islam, the ahadith and their sunnah were as authoritative as the Quran, that in fact Maliki ulama in al-Andalus accepted the famous saying of such respected traditionists as al-Awza'i, circa 704 to 774, and Yahya ibn Abi Kathir, died 748, according to which the Quran is in greater need of the Sunnah for its elucidation than the Sunnah is of the Quran, and that the Islamic texts were not open to interpretation by just any individual believer, but must be mediated by properly qualified clerics. Without questioning or interrogating the subjectivities of the scholars of the Maliki school of jurisprudence in al-Andalus, this book takes seriously and at face value their interpretations and practices, including their belief in a divine revelation independent of changing socioeconomic or historical conditions. This understanding of Islamic law as something transcendent and not subject to innovation was shared even by the great alim, meaning wise or learned, Ibn Hazm, not a friend of Malikiism. For all these traditionalists and enemies of innovation, and despite their individual rivalries and differences, Islam did not need to be and must not be adapted to new circumstances. This book gives special attention to primary sources, medieval Christian, Muslim, and Jewish chronicles, literary works, religious and legal texts, and biographies, and usually quotes them verbatim so that non-scholars can read these materials, which in modern publications on Islamic Spain frequently are not part of the narrative and often not even part of the notes, and decide for themselves whether the widespread hagiographic interpretations of Islamic Spain are warranted or not. Unless otherwise indicated, assertions in this book are abundantly supported by these medieval Christian, Muslim, and Jewish primary sources, which are either quoted in the text or cited in the notes. One may disagree with and instinctively reject 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these sources, whose assertions contradict comfortable beliefs, or one may raise questions about what these testimonies really mean in order defensively to undermine their authority, but after a while, the sheer number of assertions from so many different sources becomes difficult to refute, and their cumulative effect even harder to dispel. As far as the available documentary evidence and the limited space have allowed, this book follows the hermeneutic criterion of multiple attestations. Thus, for example, the more widely distributed a particular religious or legal teaching and its accompanying practice are across sources, the greater the probability that such teaching and practice permeated everyday life. And the more in agreement antagonistic sources, say Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, are on a particular cultural or historical proposition, the greater the truth value of that proposition. All sorts of arguments have been made to question the validity of the Muslim sources. Some Western scholars today describe them as texts embellished by legends, serving political and religious agendas, and written too many centuries after the events. But dismissing Muslim chronicles presents problems. One is that the chronicles claim to use earlier materials closer to the events described, and that some of the Muslim chronicles probably date from less than 2 centuries after the conquest. Another problem is that some scholars who doubt the accuracy of the Muslim sources have often employed them to make claims regarding the splendor of the civilization of Islamic Spain, and also to reduce the figure of traditional Christian heroes such as El Cid to impious warriors and mere mercenaries. One cannot have it both ways. Finally, disregarding primary sources because they may contain embellishments and legends or serve a political and religious agenda can leave scholars with limited working material and deprive them of a great deal that legends, fiction, embellishments, and political and religious agendas can tell about a culture and even about historical happenings. In any event, as even the professor of Hebrew Studies Norman Roth admits, a detailed analysis of these sources results in a remarkably coherent and generally consistent account of the invasion and conquest of Spain. The scholar of Islamic and Arabic studies Tarif Khalidi's examination of the various factors that affected the writing.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?